Good day, folks. Welcome to today's podcast, Understanding China Part 5, China in the Reform Era. So, this is a podcast I've wanted to make for a while, mainly because it's the area of Chinese history that I've studied the most. However, it was necessary to create the preceding podcasts, and those podcasts do cover essential information. But China in the late 70s and 1980s is also essential information. Indeed, you see more transformation and more change in China in that decade than you do in perhaps perhaps many other decades combined. But let's not focus on vague descriptions. Let's get to the meat and bones of the argument. So, before I begin this podcast, I'm very cognizant of the famous quote by Eleanor Roosevelt: "Small minds discuss people, average minds discuss events, great minds discuss ideas." So, I'm aware that before we go any further, there's going to be a lot of talk about people in this podcast, but there's also going to be talk about ideas and the ideas these people generated. You can't really do a good podcast on China without talking about people, because in China leadership matters. In the West, and some people in the West or some strains of thoughts view government as at best a necessary evil, but in China government is viewed as a necessary virtue. So leaders do matter. The personalities of these leaders do matter, but the leaders do follow with the times. If they don't follow the times, or if they ignore the times too much, they'll lose the mandate of heaven and they'll be swept away. So leaders matter, and it's from the leaders that the ideas are realised. So just a bit about leaders. So we left at the last podcast with the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. So this was a year of the loss of three very significant people. First Zhou Enlai, then Zhu De, then Mao Zedong. So as I said, Mao Zedong had proposed three previous successors. First Liu Shaoqi, then Lin Biao, and then finally Zhou Enlai. As stated earlier, Zhou Enlai dies 9 months before Mao Zedong of bladder cancer. So the man who replaced Zhou Enlai as premier was a relatively unknown provincial official named Hua Guofeng. Well, his real name was Su Ju, but he was best and is remembered by his nom de guerre, Hua Guofeng. Now, this helps explain years which are overlooked in 2 years in China, which are often overlooked, 1976 to 1978. Rather than, I won't say overlooked, but then normally you have these eras of Mao Zedong era, 1949 to 1976, then the Deng Xiaoping era, commonly dated as 1978 to 1992. Now, a good example is, I remember at my previous position in Beijing, myself and my colleagues were watching the 2017 Party Congress, and I was watching then Premier Li Keqiang read out the names of the previous leaders of China: Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and I remember saying, "He forgot Hua Guofeng." Well, the reality is Hua Guofeng is not officially, canonically recognised by the CCP as a leader, or at least he's not, if you like the example just given. But I want to say, in my humble opinion, Hua Guofeng deserves a better place in history than he's given. So he was born in Shanxi province in 1921, but the main position he'd run, he'd been party secretary of Hunan province. Now, he was chosen by Mao Zedong to replace Zhou Enlai as premier upon the former's death. And after eventually Mao Zedong settled upon him as his chosen successor, with the often quoted phrase, "With you in charge, I am at ease." Now, Hua Guofeng was, like I said, an unknown, which is that's an immediate obstacle. He comes in as an unknown. He's also much younger. He's a full generation younger than China's previous leadership, and he's also he has no military experience. This is a crucial point. So, but I would like to talk about the good things he did. So, unfortunately, Hua Guofeng is remembered for the two whatevers. So everybody has their every leader of China has their contribution to the canon of socialism with Chinese characteristics, obviously. Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, Jiang Zemin's free represents, and Hu Jintao's theory of scientific development. Now, Hua Guofeng is associated with the two whatevers, which, from the top of my head, was we will continue any policies that Mao Zedong implemented, and we will not sway from whatever he said. That's maybe not a completely accurate quote, but either way, it's kind of vague and uninspiring. But this was more of a what I would call a survival tactic, because when you come into office as a new leader, you can't it's a mistake to set yourself in the shadow of the predecessor or try to imitate the predecessor. You have to have a break, but a clean break from the predecessor. But you also need to adhere to some of the traditions and what's been established. It's a tricky thing. I mean, for example, John F. Kennedy's a very popular president, but Dwight D. Eisenhower was a popular president. They were both very different in look and style. Dwight D. Eisenhower was seen as a rather avuncular, esteemed elder statesman, whereas John F. Kennedy was much younger, and Dwight D. Eisenhower played golf, whereas John F. Kennedy would play football on the White House lawn. He didn't try to be like Dwight D. Eisenhower, but now he was his own man. So Hua Guofeng made the mistake of trying to play it both ways. Some say that he even styled his hair similar to Mao Zedong. He had very similar propaganda posters to Mao Zedong, but he was not continuing the most of the Mao line, especially not the Cultural Revolution. So if one thing Hua Guofeng deserves credit for is the decisive ending of the Cultural Revolution and ordering the arrest of the Gang of Four. Now, the Gang of Four is Jiang Qing, the widow of Mao Zedong, Jiang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen. Now, these were the far left instigators and primary agitators of the Cultural Revolution, upon much of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution are attributed to. Now, the story goes that they were planning a coup against the new leader of Hua Guofeng and possibly the leadership in general, and this was snuffed out. Even the extent to which that's true, I don't know, but nonetheless, this was a successful removal of the far left faction, and people had had enough of this. People had enough of the Cultural Revolution, and they just wanted to get back to development. No less things to be focused upon ideology, more focus on development. So Hua Guofeng also ended, reinstated the National College examination, and we have the universities begin to operate unrestricted again after the interruption of the Cultural Revolution. And also, Hua Guofeng supported special economic zones. Now, special economic zones were primarily the work of Deng Xiaoping, but Hua Guofeng did, at least in his capacity as leader, however much authority he had at the time, he did oversee the opening of the first special economic zones. So what went wrong? Well, the main thing was what that went wrong was just unfortunately him. He hadn't been on the Long March. He had no military experience, and this had him as a leader who lacked the revolutionary pedigree of, well, most people around him, because the Long March generation, more about them later, was still very much the centre of power. So while he actually held three positions that no one's ever held simultaneously before, chairman, premier, and chairman of the military commission. Now remember that party chairman or general secretary, I'll just say party leadership, is often combined with the presidency, not the premiership. And it's always often combined with the chairmanship of the military commission as well. But he was the only person to be both premier and party leader. But he just didn't have the authority because he wasn't a World War II or a Long March veteran. And the centre of gravity very much was all around the more esteemed statesmen. They're often referred to as the eight immortals, or officially the eight esteemed statesmen, which, if I remember correctly, were Deng Xiaoping, Li Shanian, Yang Shangkong, Bo Yibo, Chen Yun, Wang Zhen, Peng Zhen, and Song Renchong. In some readings, Dong Yingqiao, the widow of Zhou Enlai, is often considered one of the eight immortals. Also, Shi Zhongshun is also sometimes considered one of the eight immortals. Now, a bit more about Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping had been purged from the leadership twice, possibly three times. I know he was purged in the Cultural Revolution and was sent to work in a tractor factory in Jiangxi province. He was brought back under Mao when he was overseeing the transport on the railways, but he was purged again at the instigation of Jiang Qing. Him and Jiang Qing famously did not get along. Well, she didn't really get along with many people, but anyway. But Mao Zedong had never ever stripped him, Deng Xiaoping, of his party membership. He always made sure that he was kept within the party because he recognised him as a potential successor, as a potential steady hand who could be brought back, which is why he was never expelled from the party, even when he'd been purged, often for political expediency. His talent as a leader had always been recognised by Mao Zedong and many others. So he was back and was, again, Hua Guofeng oversaw the rehabilitation of Deng Xiaoping, which again is something Hua Guofeng deserves credit for. So I believe Hua Guofeng deserves a better place in history than he's been given. But that's all I'll say about him for now. So about Deng Xiaoping. Well, Deng Xiaoping was born in Sichuan province in 1904. Now his main formative experience was that he went to Paris on the work-study program, where students would work in factories in France and study at the university. It's there where he met Zhou Enlai and where he also joined the Chinese Communist Party, or rather what was then the early workings of it, while he was in Paris. He also studied in Moscow at the toilers of the East University, and he was a participant in the Long March. And he'd held positions in government since the 1950s. He now he came back as vice premier. Now, when he was when he effectively pushed Hua Guofeng aside, and I won't say forced him into early retirement, because Hua Guofeng kept his position on the Central Committee until 2002. But Hua Guofeng just became kind of irrelevant. He was never purged. He was never sent to prison, or anything like what would happen in previous eras. His authority just dwindled. So Deng Xiaoping had been recognised by Carter and other members of the Carter administration as the effective leader of China when he visited in 1978. So Deng Xiaoping becomes vice premier, but also late, I believe, after the third plenum in 1978, he replaces Hua Guofeng as chairman of the Central Military Commission. So there's a common myth that Deng Xiaoping never held the position of chairman, but he did, chairman of the Military Commission, which is a very important position. He just wasn't chairman of the party. The position of chairman of the party was held by Hua Guofeng, but then passed to Hu Yaobang, where I think after 2 years it was renamed General Secretary. So his proteges were Hu Yaobang, who became General Secretary, and Zhao Ziyang, who became Premier and eventually succeeded Hu Yaobang as General Secretary upon his removal from office in 1987 due to economic mismanagement and deemed to be too sympathetic to student protesters. So going back to 1978, the important point is at this point people were tired of ideology. They were tired of the excesses of ideology, and the Cultural Revolution had set China back economically. So there had to be more of a focus on development and less of a focus on ideology, which is where the famous, probably the most famous proverb associated with Deng Xiaoping comes in. It doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches mice. Now this signals a willingness to be colourblind to ideology. What matters is development. It doesn't matter if it's what ideological stripe this development takes. So it's worth noting that the post 1978 China, although Deng Xiaoping is considered the primary architect, it's not the sole work of Deng Xiaoping, the same way how Mao's China was not the sole work of Mao. Many people, it's the work of all the Chinese people, really, but the ideas, Deng Xiaoping was a great shaper of the idea. He realised that what matters is development. We need to focus more on development, less on ideology. He also famously said, socialism is not poverty. To get rich is glorious. So at this point, we realise that China has, to its credit, had consecutive years of 4% economic growth. But China's still not that rich. By the 80s, the three essentials for marriage are considered to be the three rounds: the wristwatch, the TV, and the bicycle, or in some accounts it's a sewing machine. But he realises that if China wants to get richer, well, one thing is it can't do it alone. We need the help and assistance of other countries. We're going to do it on our own terms. We're going to accept help, but we're going to be more open to ideas, which is why it's called reform and opening up. So special economic zones are an important part of that, because special economic zones allow foreign direct investment in particular areas, the first of which is Shenzhen. Now, Shenzhen was just a village in 1978. Now it's, by some counts, the fourth largest city in China. And this was all through the massive economic growth, with it being a special economic zone where open trade and foreign direct investment rolls in. This was an important realization. China has a lot of cheap labour. I'm sorry if that sounds disparaging, but it's true. China can offer a massive labour force to the rest of the world, and China can be an exporting powerhouse. So made in China really kicks off. Now, when I say about this isn't the sole work of Deng Xiaoping, well, it's worth remembering that many of the ideas, and the more controlled aspect of the ideas, the more cautious approach, could probably be attributed to Chen Yun. Now, Chen Yun was, I believe, an engineer by trade. He's considered one of the 8 immortals, and he'd held positions in the Politburo Standing Committee since the 1950s. He's famously attributed with a more cautious approach to economic development, and it's called the birdcage theory, wherein you have to keep a bird in a cage rather than just letting it fly randomly. So that's why special economic zones were a compromise measure. That let's try it out in this particular economic zone, and if it works, let's expand it throughout the country. So, as Deng Xiaoping said, let some areas get rich first. The areas which get rich first will help the other areas get rich. So, first of all, build up investment, build up coastal cities. I mean, coastal cities are where most of the wealth is. Places like Shanghai, Hangzhou, Wenzhou, Xiamen, Shenzhen. Those are often some of the richest cities in China. Those, as wealth builds up, it can be reinvested in the interior. And obviously everybody would say that the interior provinces are now much richer than they originally were. Anybody who's seen, well, all, without going into too much detail, all Chinese cities are much richer, much more developed than previously. It's just undisputably. So, well, how did it get there? So, first of all, special economic zones. The special economic zones worked. So that model could then be exported to the rest of the country. Now, many people describe China as being an export economy. Well, it's an export economy, but it's also an investment economy. The proceeds from foreign trade are reinvested. They're reinvested throughout the country. There's a good quote of Deng Xiaoping: "If you want to get rich, build the road first." This again, if you want a country to get rich, you need the infrastructure. This is so the proceeds from the China's economic model have been used for massive investment in public works. You don't need to just read books. Just go to China and see all the high-speed rail. I was in China for 15 years. I came in 2009, and there was only one high-speed route available to me. That was Beijing to Qingdao, and that took 6 hours. Now I believe you get from Beijing to Qingdao in 2 hours, and now just about every city is connected to the high-speed rail network. Every major city, I think, except for Lhasa, which I'm not sure if it's, at least with today's technology, it's very difficult to build high-speed rail through that terrain, but let's not go into that. So again, from this point onwards, we've got a very strongly export orientated model and a very strong investment orientated model. So does it all go smooth? Well, uh, the problem is with what's called this model. It's often called the Gerschenkron model, named after the Ukrainian economist Gerschenkron, who observed it. The problem is that eventually an economy, a country that follows this model, begins building bridges to nowhere. By bridges to nowhere, I mean pointless infrastructure. Uh, so, yeah, I mean, there's no denying that that has happened in China. I mean, like what would they call the ghost cities? The wave upon wave of apartment blocks which are empty and haven't been sold, and many other public, perhaps public work projects which just don't serve much of a purpose. But that's an inevitable consequence of the Gerschenkron model. Also, inevitably, things start to overheat. You have too much economic growth, means inflation, and it means debt. So this is what takes us to to basically kind of takes us on a quantum leap to the China of now, which is trying to get this under control and basically slow the engine down. So at the time, this does result in two hiccups. There's student process in '87, which sees the removal of Hu Yaobang, considered too sympathetic, and the subsequent student protests in '89. Zhao Ziyang was again deemed to be too sympathetic, and which is why he was later removed as general secretary. Now, a myth that has circulated about China in this era is that a myth that's perpetuated by Naomi Klein in her book The Shock Doctrine was that the ending of the student protests was the shock necessary for further reform, but that didn't happen. There wasn't further reform following the evacuation of the square in '89. Rather, there was reform went into suspended animation. Then Premier Li Peng actually implemented an austerity program in a rather smart move to quell inflation, to get to stop the inflation, to stop things getting the runaway economic growth overheating. Now, further reform and further free market based reform just didn't happen for another 2 years until Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour in 1992. Now, Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern Tour is often considered his final act as a statesman. It's possible he retained influence between then and the 5 years up to his death in '97. However, the Southern Tour, when he was accompanied by his daughter and went on his private train, visiting factories and in Shenzhen and other special economic zone areas. This basically was a reminder to the leadership that get on with it. Basically, don't stray from the model that has got us to where we are. We're much richer now than we were in 1978. Don't go back to that. Don't put an end to economic reform. Let's get things moving again, and that's what happened. And again, this is partly because of leadership. Because at this point, after Zhao Ziyang was removed, he was replaced by Jiang Zemin, who had previously served as party secretary of Shanghai. Now, Jiang Zemin had overseen student protests and resolved them without any bloodshed, and he was seen as a more steady hand. But again, he was largely an administrator, and he hadn't developed the leadership pedigree at that point. However, it was after 92 when he was basically his formal his trial let's call it his trial period as leader under Deng Xiaoping, who still retained massive influence. Now, he gave Jiang Zemin the party leadership, the position of General Secretary in 89, and the position of chairmanship of the Military Commission. And Deng Xiaoping had announced his retirement. However, the Southern Tour was his way of coming out of retirement and basically telling the leadership, pull your finger out, get on with it. We can't go back to pre-1978. It's just not going to work. Well, I put you there, and I put you there for a reason. Prove yourself and get on with the economic reform again. And that's what happened. So I'll just wrap it up here. The Jiang Zemin era and Hu Jintao eras can be covered in subsequent podcasts, but let me just sum up today's podcast with some key points. At this point, leadership pedigree matters. It's not so much about positions. It's, to use a famous quote by Machiavelli, titles don't honour men honour titles. Well, Deng Xiaoping didn't really need that many titles. He had the prestige from the Long March and from the previous positions in government and proven record as a leader. He didn't need to be General Secretary or Premier. Just chairmanship of the Military Commission was enough. So again, we see the positions of State President, General Secretary and chairmanship of the Military Commission all held by different people at this period. Most of the 80s, the position of President was held by Li Shanian and then later by Yang Shankong. It wasn't until 93 when all three positions were combined in the person of Jiang Zemin, and that's generally the way it's been since 1993. Normally, the person who is General Secretary is also President and Chairman of the Military Commission. So at this point, so again, China in the 80s is still the power is focused on the revolutionary generation. The revolutionary generation are pragmatic and they realise they have to go with what works. The key point is reform, but reform under the existing system. Don't shake things up politically. That can lead you down a road where the outcome may not be very good. It wasn't very good in the Soviet Union and what's now Russia and the 14 other former Soviet republics. This didn't lead anywhere good. And it wouldn't lead anywhere good in China. We can be certain about that. So reform, but keep a steady hand. And that's what happened. So an important point to remember is that more change happens in 1980s China than many other decades put together. China sets itself off to be an economic superpower in 1978. This is where China's high-speed growth of 8, 9 or even 10% or more per annum kicks in. And China's political structure, as it is today, very much owes itself to the reforms at the end of the 1970s. So subsequent eras such as those under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao will be covered in subsequent podcasts, but that's all for today. Thank you all and thanks for watching.